Hey, what's up guys, back again with another video in the C++ series. This episode I'm going to be teaching about the for loop. So last episode I taught you about the while loop and the do while loop, which loop under a condition. This new type of loop I'm going to be teaching you, the for loop, loops not just on a condition but also allows what is called an initialization statement to create a variable. So the idea behind that is that you create a variable at the same time that the for loop is being created itself, so that you don't have to create extra variables each time you need a loop, and you can use that variable to eventually change the condition of the loop like we did before. And that variable that we're going to be creating is only available to the loop, it's not available to anything else. So it's a special little variable especially for the loop that we can use for working with the loop and changing the condition. And I'll be showing you, don't worry. It's always better to show you examples rather than explaining them by the mouth. You know what I mean. So for loops, we're going to say easily specify the amount of times to iterate. Okay, and so let's go ahead and create our first for loop. So to create a for loop, all you gotta do is type for, and then in parentheses here, like you would normally do, you're gonna have a condition, but not just a condition. First you're gonna have what's called an initialization statement or an expression. So usually what you want to have here is a variable. You're gonna create a variable and initialize it. So this is gonna be the variable for our loop. So let's just create a variable, and usually whenever you're working with loops, you're gonna name this variable I. That just stands for iteration or something like that. I don't know what it actually stands for, but that's typically by convention what developers use for their for loop integer, okay, or whatever variable it is, okay. So int I is equal to 0. We're going to start at 0, and then after that, after we have our initialization statement or expression, whatever you want to call it, we need to have our condition. So as long as I is less than 10 I++, okay? So then you could open it up like that. You can put it on a new line if you want to, the code block. You know, I told you this before. You can do it like that, but I'm used to, with Java, I usually do it like that. Okay, it doesn't actually matter. So now after that, we need to, add something to our loop. What's going to happen every time that this loop iterates, right? So simply, let's just go ahead and print out the value of I so we can see how the value of I changes over time. And before I run this program, I'm going to explain how this works, okay? So the program runs line by line, as we know. So it's going to come here eventually. It's going to do for. So it knows a for loop is being created. And then here it's going to say, okay, we need to create a new variable for this for loop, okay? And this variable, since it's inside the for loop, it is going to stay accessible only to the for loop. So we cannot change the value of this variable outside of the for loop. So we can't go here and do I is equal to 25. There is no I outside of the for loop. You just simply can't do that. That's an example of scope usage. Whenever you declare a variable inside of a block of code like this, or this counts as the block of code, anything you declare inside of a block of code cannot be accessible above that block of code, meaning outside of that block of code. But if we for example create another block of code inside of this block of code like that, the variable can be accessed because it's still inside the original block of code, if that makes sense. That's just a simple explanation of scope. But the point is, this variable here is only accessible to the for loop, okay? So this is going to create a variable called I is going to be equal to 0. And then after that, we're saying as long as I is less than 10, then you're going to iterate, you're going to loop, right? And so right after that, we're going to have I++. And this is going to be the part that is run after the loop runs each time, okay? So after it's done iterating the loop, it's going to do I++, which is I plus 1, right? So that's just the final expression, right? So this is the initialization expression, but this one's going to be like, I forgot what the exact terminology for this is, but this is going to be the final expression because this is the last piece of code that's going to be executed after the loop iterates. So this is basically a while loop, except more compact, more easier to work with, okay? Because normally with the while loop, we would do something like this. We would do int x is equal to 0 while x is less than 10, and then we would put our code here, x inline, and then after that we would do x plus like that. So it's basically the same exact thing as what I coded here, but all put together inside of the parentheses here. So it's easier to code and just look at generally, okay? So that's pretty cool. Hopefully that makes that gives you a bigger picture of how it works. So now let's try running this to see what happens, okay? Let's look at the console and see what happens. So as you can see here, it's iterating and it's spitting out stuff into the console here. So we see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 9. And so this is simply because we're starting at 0, of course, and then it prints out 0, because 0 is less than 10, so it's going to iterate and print that out. Let's get rid of this. And then after that, it's going to do I++, so then it's going to become 1, and it's just going to repeat eventually until it reaches 9. So it's going to print out 9, right? And then it's going to do I++, so then it's going to become 10 after that 9 iteration. And so then it's going to do I is less than 10, or yeah, I is less than 10, it's going to be false, so then it's not going to iterate, right? So of course, I explained that last episode, but that's why it stops at 9, not 10. It's a little confusing for beginner developers. So hopefully that makes sense for you. But yeah, it's very similar to the while loop, except that, you know, we're doing it all within the parentheses, right? So that's a very simple. Of course, we can do other things. We can change this to like 100, 1,000, and then we could do I minus minus if we want to. So we can, let's see here. Let's try changing this to as long as I is bigger than 1, or let's do 0, I guess. Then we're going to do I minus minus, and let's start at a big number like this. So we're going to create a variable, let's see, 0, 0, 0, 0, that's going to be 1 million. So it's going to start at 1 million, and then as long as 1 million, or as long as the number is bigger than 100, or bigger than 0, excuse me, it's going to go down by 1. So we should see about 1 million iterations. That should happen whenever we run this, okay? So let's try this out. Let's see what happens. Should be pretty cool, because that's a lot of iterations. So as you can see, it's counting down really fast from 1 million. It's going to take some time, obviously, because it's a really big number, but we're going to get there eventually. And something really cool on this side here, the diagnostics tools tab here, you can see that it shows your memory usage, and then also shows your CPU. Of course, this is not like a highly intensive program. It's not using a lot of my CPU power, so it's very low. But that's pretty cool, right? It shows that cool stuff. Memory usage. CPU usage. But yeah, it's pretty cool, right? So it's still counting down, as you can see. It's about 80,000 currently. I just clicked in it. It paused it for some reason. Might be lagging or something like that. Oh, it exited for some reason. I guess I messed it up. So yeah, you get the point. That's just how you make a for loop here. A very simple for loop. You know how to work with the conditions now. Very simple. So yeah, if you have any questions about the simple for loop or the for loop at all, you can ask in the comment section below. But we're not done. We're not done. So for loops are also very useful for looping through arrays. So we can create an array here. I'm gonna just make an example array, or let's give it an array size of 5. So this loop is gonna have 5 integers within it, because it's gonna be integer, or no, it's gonna have 5 elements within it. It's gonna be a string array, okay? So it's gonna have 5 strings within the array. So string names, this is gonna be a names array, that's what we'll call it. And then we just plug in array size like that. We could have put 5 inside of here, but I'll show you why we want to make it a variable. You don't have to, but I'll show you why that's kind of useful. So what we're gonna do here is initialize it. So each string by default is gonna be just a empty space, okay? So that's gonna be each string in it by default. And so now let's print out this here. I need 5 names. Please help me out. Okay. So it's gonna ask us for 5 names, then we're gonna, you know, print out those 5 names after we're done asking for them. But so we're gonna create a for loop here. If you wanna, you know, autocomplete, you just press tab after you type for. So we can do for tab, and now it's gonna autocomplete. And the first thing it asks us to do, it's highlighted here. We need to specify what integer we're going to use for this, or what data type we want to use for the for loop. We can do anything. We could even do auto if we want to, so we can assume our data type. But we're just going to keep it simple. We're going to do integer I is equal to 0, and then as long as I is less than array size, array size like that, tab to autocomplete. And so what this is going to do is we're looping through the size of the array. So we know that the array is going to hold 5 elements, right? So we need to loop 5 times, right? Because we're going to be accessing all 5 of the elements. Pretty simple concept, hopefully. And so now what we're going to do is say cout, give me a name, please. Okay. And then we're not going to add a flush statement here, because after that we're going to ask for some input. So names, and then inside of here we're going to put I. So what it's going to do here is ask for the index that it's currently looping through, right? So it's going to start at 0, because of course we know that arrays are 0 based, so that's good that it starts at 0. I is equal to 0. So it's going to go here and say names element 0. So that's going to be basically asking for the first element in the array, okay? And then after that, it's going to do I++, and then it's going to ask for the next element, all the way up to 4, because, you know, there's the 4th index, right? It's going to be the 5th element, right? So it's going to get up to there, and then it's going to be done. So now after that, it's going to say, let's say, thanks. Sorry, I can't type. Let me show you all of the numbers now. Or not numbers, names now. Inline. So before we do that, before we repeat the names that we just gave to the console, to the console back to the user, let's just go ahead and test this out. So what this is going to do, if you don't know by now, is just simply ask for 5 names, and then it's going to assign it to that. It's going to put it in an array, okay? So it says, give me a name, please. We'll say Bob, Billy, Billy. Oh, that's a weird glitch there. And Sandra. Okay. Looks like it kind of glitched here. I may have pressed enter 2 times by accident, so one of them is going to be blank. But as you can see here, it asks for all 5 of the names, and we put them in there, and it should have stored them in the array. Okay. So now let's go ahead and spit out all those names from the array so we can check and see if it actually stored them correctly, right? So we'll do for int I is equal to 0. We're basically just going to do the same thing. I is less than array size again, right? Because the size of the array never changed. And so inside of here, we're just going to print out each of the elements in the array. So cout names I, which is going to stand for index in this case. And that should be it, okay? Let's try running this. Bob, Billy, Randy, Billy, Bob. Apparently all of our names are rednecks. That's okay. So we got Bob, Billy, Randy, and Billy Bob. Billy Bob was counted as 2 names apparently. Kind of strange. That's no problem, whatever. Because this is just for testing purposes, not a real program. But yeah, as we can see here, it stored all 5 of those names that we entered into the array. And we know that it did that because we just printed out all the values from the array. Pretty cool. We just printed out all the elements. So this is a very common usage for loops. It's very common to use them for working with arrays. So that's a very good thing to know how to do. And so there's actually a simpler way of working with arrays and for loops. It's called range-based for loops, which was introduced in C++ version 11, or C++ 11, whatever it's called. So it's like this. It's called range-based loops, but first we need an array to work with here. Let's just make a new one. So int numbers is going to be an array with a bunch of numbers. So 13, 13 again, 4, 2, 4, 1, 2, whatever. I just put random numbers. So it's going to be an array here, and then now let's print out each value in the array. So there's a very simple array, way of doing it. Let's just get rid of all this here. So the first thing we're going to provide is our initialization, or what's it called, variable. So we're just going to call it int variable. It doesn't actually matter what you call it, of course, because it's just a simple variable. And then now we're going to put a colon, and then after that colon we put the array that we want to loop through. Okay. So basically what is going to happen here is C++ is very intelligent and knows what we're doing here. So it knows that it needs to create a variable here. And let's actually change this to element. So what this variable is going to represent is the element that we're on currently, because of course when we did this before, the I variable here would represent the element that we're currently on, the index that we're currently on. So this would represent the index before, but now we're working with this, the range-based for loop. So the variable here this time is going to be representing the element itself, so we don't actually have to use the index. It can print out the whole element. So I'll show you that in a second. And then after that, we're simply giving it the array we want to loop there. So it's very intelligent and knows what we're doing, okay? So let me show you how this works. So we can print out simply elements of the array. And all we got to do here, instead of providing an index and all that stuff, we can simply put element by itself. And that's gonna represent, whatever iteration the element that it's trying to print out, right? So let's try printing this out, see what we get. So it should print out all the elements here, if we did it correctly. So it says, oh, we need to skip through all this crap here. Oh, dang it. Let's try this again. So it says, thanks, let me show you all the names now, blah, blah, blah. And then we can see that it says names of, or elements of the array, 1, 13, 13, 4, 2, and then 3, 1, 2, 4. So it successfully was able to print out all of the elements inside of the array. And we can use any data type. We can use a string array, float array, double array, anything we want to use. But that's just a simple way of looping through an array if you ever need to do that. And we can use this not just for printing out the values of an array, we can also use it for setting the values of an array. We could have done that up here if we wanted to. But yeah, that's a range-based array, okay? Or for loop, excuse me. Range-based for loop. So now let's move on to nested for loops, which are very similar to the if statement, or the nested if statements, which is basically just a for loop inside of a for loop, okay? So let me demonstrate how this would look like. So we can do int, and let's just give it a variable of a. Of course, it doesn't matter what the variable name is. Let's say a is less than 5, so it's going to loop 5 times, and let's have another for loop inside of it. And we're going to call this b because before we already created a variable a, and I told you a little bit ago about scope, so a is already a variable inside of this block of code here. So now we're going to create a new variable b so we don't mess with this variable here, okay? So b is going to be less than, we'll choose a number like 3, okay? And so this is an nested for loop. It's very interesting. So this means that every time this top loop runs, this one is going to run 3 times because, you know, we know that this top one, you know, let's pretend that this doesn't exist for a second, okay? So we know that this for loop here is going to run 5 times because, of course, we're starting at 0, and then 0 is less than 5. So it's going to run 5 times. So and then we're going to put this back here. So each time this loop runs once, this one is going to loop 3 times. Okay, because every time this one runs, this block of code is being run inside of that for loop. So every iteration this is going to run, and this loop by itself, if this one did not exist, this one would be looping 3 times, okay, by itself. So now that it's inside of this for loop here, each time this for loop iterates, it's going to run this one 3 times within that single iteration, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. So that means that this nested for loop as a total is going to be running 15 times, because 5 times 3, this is going to be running 5 times each, and then each of those 5 times is going to be running 3 times, okay? So it's going to be running 15 times total. Hopefully that makes sense. So we can print this out, you know, just to see how it might work or look like. Cout a, comma, space, b, inline. Let's run this here. Oh, we put 2 a's by accident. Wrong thing. Let's try this again. So we can see that it does 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2. So the reason it's 0, 0, 0 is because it's still in that first iteration on the top for loop. So it's staying on 0, the index of 0, so it's staying on 0, and then it's going to 0, 1, 2 because it's still running 3 times on that initial loop. So now it's going to the next one. After this one runs 3 times, it's going to go to the next iteration on the top loop. It's going to do 1, 1, 1. It's going to go 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, all the way up to 5 times total. And then it's just going to loop 3 times within each of those iterations, okay? That's a very simple concept. Well, it's kind of confusing at first when you first learn it, but hopefully that makes sense. So if we were to change this to, for example, 6 and 5, that means that this is going to run 6 times. The top loop is going to run 6 times, and then each of those 6 times is going to run 5 times, okay? So as a total, it's going to be 30 times, because I believe 6 times 5 is 30. So yeah, it's going to run 30 times for that whole loop, okay? So one reason you might want to use a nested for loop is actually for multi-dimensional arrays. You know, we know how to print out a regular array with a regular for loop, but with multi-dimensional arrays, there's obviously multiple dimensions. So we can use multiple for loops and nested for loop to print out the value of that multi-dimensional array. So let me show you. This is going to be kind of cool. So cats 4 and 3. I named it cats because I have no idea what else to name it. So we can just give it some values here. I'm just going to copy and paste it because I'm lazy. So there we go. We have a multi-dimensional array here. And let's try printing out the value of that multi-dimensional array. So we're going to have a for loop here. Let's do int row. We're going to call it row, because if you remember how multi-dimensional arrays work, it's going to have a row. This is going to be a row here. This was 1 row, 2 row, 3, 4. So we're going to have 4 rows total. So we need to print out each row or loop through each row. And then after it loops through the first row, it's going to print out each column, right? So it doesn't matter. I'll show you. So there's going to be 4 rows, of course, like we know. So 4 here. And then it's going to loop through 3 columns. So we know there's 3 columns. So we need to make another for loop here. Int column is equal to 0. Column less than 3, because we know that there's 3 inside the second array or whatever, or second index for the multi-dimensional array. Size, whatever you want to call it. So now we have column here. So column plus, and then we'll open this up. So what this is going to do is loop 4 times, and then each of those 4 times is going to loop 3 times. So now let's go ahead and print out each value here. So cout element. This is going to be kind of confusing, but don't worry. So element row. So it's going to print out the first element here in the row, like that. Okay, and I'll explain this in a second. Don't worry. Column, like that. Okay, so that's going to be basically showing the index of the whatever we're about to print out, the index of the element. So after that, we'll put the element itself. So cats, row, and then column. Okay, and then inline. I know that's a lot, so let me show you before I explain it. Let's print it out. And what it should do is print out each value inside the multidimensional array. So we can see here it's doing 5, 2, 4, 2, 14, 1. Yeah, that's exactly what it's printing out to the console. So it was successfully able to print out each value. So we can see here that's going through each value in the array. It's going row by row. So it's starting with the 0 row, the first row here. So 5, 2, and 4. So that's how it's working. So each row is going to loop 3 times because there's 3 elements in each row. And there's 4 rows total. So 1, 1, 1. So if that's the next one, so it's going to be 2, 14, 1. Then that's next, and then it goes to the next one and the next one, okay? So it's very simple. What it's doing here is basically looping through each row, and then each of those rows is looping through each column, okay? Very simple. It's just going step by step through each of the elements of the multidimensional array. So hopefully this makes sense here. If you have any questions about what I did, you can ask me in the comment section below. But I would rather you join our Discord, by the way. There's a Discord link in the description below. If you want to join our Discord, you can ask questions. And if you don't have any questions, I would still like you to join us, hang out with us, you know, whatever you want to do. But yeah, that's pretty much it for arrays. I mean, not arrays, for loops. This really turned into an array tutorial, didn't it? But yeah, this is pretty much it for loops. We learned about, you know, regular for loops by themselves. We learned about nested for loops, range-based for loops for easily looping through arrays. And that's pretty much it. So again, if you have any questions, ask. Don't be afraid to ask. And also pretty important, all of the code from today's episode is going to be in the description below, so you can check out the code for, you know, in case in the future you might forget how to do this. So you can check out the code after you bookmark it today, and then come back to it later on. Okay. So if you like this video, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe, and peace.